So good afternoon, Songdo, and good morning, Rome, to our guest panelists. Welcome to the Independent Evaluation Unit's webinar on impact evaluations. I am Unica Aure, a monitoring and evaluation specialist at the GCF's Division of Portfolio Management, and I will be facilitating today's discussion. So it's an absolute pleasure to be a part of this incredibly interesting webinar. I'd also like to take this opportunity to say that we are one with Korea as we grieve the tragic incident that happened over the weekend. So we are also joined by three amazing panelists, all top-notch evaluators, and a couple of them are from our international accredited entities. Firstly, from the GCF's Independent Evaluation Unit, we have Dr. Anastasia Aladisheva, an impact evaluation specialist ad interim at the Independent Evaluation Unit. She manages a fraction of the LORTA portfolio and provides capacity building in impact evaluations of climate adaptation and mitigation projects. Before joining the IEU, she worked in the field of impact evaluations of development, humanitarian, and peace-building programs for over 10 years. She also worked at the ICRC, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the World Bank, and Deloitte. Second, we have Mr. Fabrizio Feloni, Deputy Director of IFAD's Independent Office of Evaluation since 2016. He was previously a lead evaluation officer at IFAD, an evaluation specialist at the Independent Evaluation Office of the United Nations Development Program in New York. He has worked on international development evaluations since 2000, leading and participating in over a dozen country programs, as well as project evaluations in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Eastern Europe. And last but not the least, we have Dr. Jonas Herman, a Senior Evaluation Officer and Head of Impact Evaluation Unit at the World Food Programme, WFP. Prior to joining WFP, Jonas was a Senior Innovation Advisor for UK Department for International Development, or DFID, and an Evaluation Advisor responsible for impact evaluations. From 2016 to 2018, Jonas was the UK advisor to the board of directors at the African Development Bank in Cote d'Ivoire. And before DFID, Jonas worked for the Institute of Development Studies in Sussex, the University of Oxford, and the European Centre for Development Policy Management, ECDPM. So welcome to our panelists. So let's give them all a virtual round of applause. Okay, so before we dive into the meat of impact evaluation, let's hear first from the evaluation specialist at the IEU, Prashant Kuturi, for the opening remarks. Over to you, Prashant.
Thanks a lot, Unica. Just to say that I had the privilege of reaching out to the colleagues in the panel and the panelists here today to confirm the participation. And just to say that I have professionally worked with them or followed their work over the years, before coming to GCF and even after coming to GCF. And I followed their work in impact evaluations very closely. And the reason why we thought of organizing this particular webinar is because impact evaluations have a very specific and interesting place in results measurement architecture of any organization. And different organizations have different experiences, of using impact evaluations. So over the years, I have seen, how IFAD has used them, the evaluation office, and also their self-evaluation function has used impact evaluations. I have seen the evolution of, from a distance, albeit, of the World Food Programme's evaluation function. And I have also, now I'm also seeing how IEU in GCF is using impact evaluations. So this was, an opportunity for, I thought that this might be a good opportunity for all of us, IEU as well as the Secretariat, to hear from the experts in this field on their experiences of undertaking impact evaluations and what are the different models that they've used in undertaking impact evaluations, what is the utility they've found, what are some of the things that they want us to avoid as pitfalls, as GCF also scales up its the tools that it uses to adhere to the results measurement framework that it has set for itself. To that extent, maybe also let me just briefly say the reasoning for having these three different organizations in one panel is because IFAD, as the evaluation office, has used impact evaluations in the past, and they have moved to a stage where impact evaluations are used more strategically and selectively and handed over to the self-evaluation function while in WFP. They're scaling up the impact evaluation program in the evaluation office, while GCF uses a completely different model where we work with accredited entities and walk them through the process of impact evaluation. So it is for this reason that we brought all these three different streams together. And I'm personally very excited to hear from their experiences, and I hope everyone in this call today will learn a lot from their experiences. Thank you. Thank you, Yunika. Over to you.
Thank you, Prashant, for that very insightful introduction. Just the opening remarks is already very exciting, and I see the numbers are ticking up. So yes, we are all with you in this excitement. Okay, but before we proceed again to the discussion, by way of introduction, we'd like to call in Dr. Anna Aladisheva. Anna will provide a brief introduction on the Learning-Oriented Real-Time Impact Assessment, or LORTA program, which has been in operation since 2018. Yes, Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yunika, for this introduction, and I'm happy to see so many people in the room, and thanks a lot very much, Prashant, for organizing this. And I'm privileged to speak about LORTA today. So I have 5 minutes, so I'll have a very quick overview of our LORTA program. Josephine, next slide, please. Thank you. So in 2018, IEU launched the so-called Learning-Oriented Real-Time Impact Assessment Program, or in short, LORTA. In this program, we provide capacity building in impact evaluations of climate adaptation mitigation projects funded by GCF. So as Prashant said, we closely work with the project teams and monitoring and evaluation focal points of the accredited entities on developing impact evaluation designs, tailor their theories of change in order to measure relevant impact indicators, help with preparation for data collection and analysis. Importantly, LORTA is demand-driven, meaning that the project teams are invited to join our yearly impact evaluation workshop, and then at the end of the workshop, they decide whether they would like to join our multi-year engagement or not. We're a relatively small team at IEU, but in the map, you can see that our portfolio is quite, I would say, relatively large, and it spans across different continents. So countries in yellow are those that we are starting our engagement, so they're in our inception phase. Countries in green are in our final impact evaluation stage, and this year we completed our first impact evaluation with UNDP in Malawi. Next slide, please. And just a few key takeaways from implementation of these impact evaluations. So what we find important is the continuous engagement and flexibility. With COVID-19, we had to keep close virtual engagement, which is not always easy. But we also learned a lot from this situation. Basically, we managed to do a lot of things on distance. For example, right now we are doing real-time quality control of data collection in Bangladesh, and we have established trust with data collection team and project team at UNDP. We completed baseline data collections, analysis, and reports remotely together in collaboration with the project teams, for example, in Guatemala, IUCN, and Zambia, UNDP. We need to adjust to the changes in implementation, as at times the project team itself has not fully established what are all the project components are and what we are exactly measuring. So it's an ongoing working relationship, ongoing process. We provide a menu of impact evaluation designs, so we make sure we have a backup plan in case if a gold standard, so to speak, a randomized control trial, randomization of project activities is not possible due to implementation constraints, political or any other concerns. And data. So I put marks there, exclamation marks there, because it's very important. It's one of the, I mean, it's maybe obvious for all of us, but data is data R is crucially important. So mistakes in data collection and then everything falls apart. So data is something that we need to really place our attention. And finally, I would like to stress that impact evaluation are a specific type of evaluation. And of course, it's not cure for everything. We have our criteria for selection into the program, but the components of impact evaluations seem to be very useful for the project teams, M&E specialists in the field, and GCF, I found. So I think I was quite short, and it was 5 minutes. Unica, thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you, Anna, for that very quick introduction of LORTA. We will have the opportunity to hear more from Anna about LORTA later on as we discuss the specifics of impact evaluation and where we will be bringing in elements of LORTA as we go along. So now we will move on to the panel discussion. And just a note on the format. The session will be more of a conversational, free-flowing discussion instead of a presentation format. So the slides that you saw from Anna, that would be the last slides that you will be seeing for the duration of this webinar. So if you have any questions, please feel free to pop them into the chat box, and I will do my best to read them as they come along. Yeah, so okay, let's begin with the discussion proper. I had a look at the names of the participants very quickly there and noticed that today we have a secretariat staff from various divisions in addition to the IEU staff, so and other independent units within the GCF. So there's a quite diverse range of attendees right now. So you could imagine that each of us are coming from a different starting point and motivation for attending this webinar. So to ensure that we are on the same page, my first question is more for definitional clarity. And that is, what is impact evaluation? What counts as impact evaluation? And I'm asking this question first and foremost, as mentioned, for clarity, but also because from my experience, there is a little variation across some organizations as to what is often described as impact evaluation. Some definitions are more restrictive than others, while the rest could be a bit liberal in their interpretation as to what counts as impact evaluation. So maybe let's begin there, and hopefully we'll be on the same page after this first question. So can I ask Fabrizio to begin? Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you again, colleagues of the Independent Evaluation Unit of GCF for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here. Now, on the definition, perhaps let me tell you a little bit our experience at IFAD. We have conducted 7 dedicated impact evaluations. We started in 2012. I did the first one in Sri Lanka, and then our colleagues follow with others. For us, these evaluation were where impact criterion had a special place, and where we conducted primary data collection on a large scale with quantitative surveys. We've done surveys from 1,500 households to almost 9,000 households in one case in India. And here where specific attention was to deal with potential sampling biases, because the project of IFAD are focusing on particularly poor areas and generally also particularly poor groups and households. So these were impact evaluation that had a special attention to the impact criterion, worked with quantitative surveys and some qualitative methods to triangulate with, and as I said, had a particular attention to sampling bias. Let me add, however, our impact evaluation did not only assess impact, and that's an important thing. We looked at the whole set of evaluation criteria at the project level. So things such as relevance, effectiveness, efficiency, sustainability. And if I can be provocative today, I would like to argue that a very major limitation of an impact evaluation is only to look at impact. I will argue later on that if you only look at impact, you have missed a lot in terms of developmental understanding of a project or developmental intervention. Sorry, I was hired today to be provocative, so I will put it this way. I will be happy to argue later on why this is the case. So for us, these evaluations were both an opportunity to assess what the IFAD-funded project done in terms of the objectives and in terms also of expected changes in people's lives. So we use the definition of impact, the standard one of the USCD DAC. But there were also an opportunity to learn what makes differences. So what are the components in a project? So developing a full theory of change, what are the interventions that generate certain impacts and certain changes? And so it was also an opportunity to learn. And I think it's also been an opportunity to test new methodological innovation or new techniques. And for example, in addition to a large surveys, we also work with software such as SenseMaker. So in a sort of quantitative analysis combination. So if you will, an opportunity to for accountability learning, but also to test a new methodology, and free. They were also an opportunity to inform new evaluations. So conduct an impact evaluation in a country where we were foreseeing a future country level evaluation. I will stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Fabrizio. That is indeed a little provocative, but at the same time, really comprehensive. What a good start. So how about Jonas? Do you have would you like to add anything to that? And perhaps, WFP has a different take on impact evaluation.
Sure. I mean, for WFP, we have a very clear definition of impact evaluation, but it actually is something that only came into the policy in 2022. And it says that we measured changes in development outcomes of interest for a target population that can be attributed to a specific program or policy through a credible counterfactual. Now, the reason I say this is something that's new for us is that for the first 4 years that I was at WFP, there was no policy definition of impact evaluation. That's something that's come later. We chose this definition by looking carefully at what was impact evaluation trying to add in a spectrum of a whole range of other types of evaluations. So we have country strategic portfolio evaluations, we have strategic evaluations, policy evaluations, decentralized evaluations. Basically, all types of evaluation were relatively accounted for in WFP prior. And we were looking at what is the additional value of impact evaluation and looking towards USAID's definition and the definition of rigorous impact evaluation at DAVAL. And it's really that it's about this counterfactual analysis. It's understanding in the world where everything is changing and evolving in a constant way, what difference does your program really make in the lives of the people that you're trying to support? And I think, so what we've done is it's a bit restrictive, it's a bit narrower, it's very aligned with rigorous impact evaluation definitions globally, but it does mean we're looking at specific narrower questions because we think that's an added value for the organization. And so in many cases, a project or different projects may not be suitable for the way we do impact evaluation, and that's fine because actually nobody has to do an impact evaluation in WFP. So I'll just leave it at there. Over.
Okay, thank you. Jonas, just a quick follow-up. So are you saying that for WFP, counterfactual analysis is an absolute requirement for it to be called impact evaluation?
Correct. That's in the policy, yes. The overall evaluation policy for WFP.
Okay, thank you. Anna, how about for the GCF IEU?
Thank you, Janika. Here I would agree with Jonas that counterfactual is key. It's like a standing stone of an impact evaluation, and I think for LORTA as well. But I'm going to fight with Fabrizio today, I think. So because I think, if I understood correctly, but in impact evaluation, we can also look at OECD DAC criteria in broader terms, if I'm correct. Because in impact evaluation, you can also look at cost effectiveness, at sustainability, and not only at the impact. So I'm always trying to defend impact evaluations because I feel that impact evaluations are broader than we sometimes think, because it has so many building blocks, so many components that are kind of overarching and that are also included in classical other types of evaluations. But it's much broader than we sometimes think. That would be my maybe response.
And for the GCF IEU, Anna, is it more for accountability or learning, or would you say equal weight for both?
It's a difficult question, but I would say it's both. I would say that's both, equally both.
Okay.
50-50, like mitigation adaptation.
Okay, that's right. Maybe a very quick follow-up on this, because we've already touched upon kind of like the purpose of impact evaluation, the usual balance between accountability and learning. Fabrizio, you also mentioned this two evaluation purposes. How is it for IFAD? How do you balance these objectives, this purpose of accountability and learning? Because from my experience, it's a difficult balance in practice. Usually it swings to one direction more than the other, but yeah, in practice, I don't think it is that straightforward from my experience. How about for IFAD?
To tell the truth, our position at IFAD is that this dichotomy, accountability and learning, has been a bit exaggerated in the past. And if you want to have learning, you also need to know what happened in relation to what the objectives were. So fundamentally, in a way, if you want to have learning, you need a little bit of accountability on one hand. And on the other hand, once you have learning, you're accountable for what you learn. If you learn, for example, why your rural finance project didn't work, you have to start designing them in a different way. You cannot just say, we've been learning how microfinance worked, and then the project design is exactly the same as the generation before. So if you will, the two are mixed together. You can see it as like a recipe where the ingredients are there, sometimes in slightly different proportions. There's some evaluation which lead themselves, or some evaluation piece of work which lead themselves, let themselves serve a bit more the purpose of one or the other. But the two, I think it's a mix which should be there all the time, including in impact evaluations for sure. So that's our view. Over.
Thank you so much. So we will be talking about more later about learning later on, but we will be mixing, we will be bringing in capacity into the mix, but we will park it for now, because I think we will have a specific segment about this a little later. But for now, I want to pick up on what Jonas actually said earlier about, and also Prashant, on being selective and strategic on selecting what projects will be subject to an impact evaluation. Because, there is a common belief that not every project is amenable to an impact evaluation. So I wanted to ask, what projects or programs from your experience lend themselves to impact evaluation of whatever combination of methodology that might be, or especially with the gold standard of having randomized experiment and a robust counterfactual. But at the same time, when I was thinking about this question, I reflected that historically, if we look at the applications of impact evaluation, we have seen that the applications of impact evaluation are actually much broader than originally envisaged. So from its early applications to health and education programs, we have seen in the 2000s how impact evaluations can be applied to agriculture, governance, financial access, security, and other type of projects as well. So somehow this tells me that there is a way to delimit or scope an impact evaluation that will make it possible in different contexts. So I was thinking that maybe the better question is, are there evaluation questions, particularly under the effectiveness or impact criterion, that are more amenable to impact evaluations? But I will leave it open for the panelists to weigh in on these two ways of thinking about the applicability of impact evaluation. So maybe I'll start with Jonas on this question.
Sure. I think there's a lot of questions there, so I'll kind of take a few of them. I do think that for WFP, although I agree, I actually agree with Fabrizio that this dichotomy between learning and accountability is false, that the purpose for WFP is it has two major reasons why we do impact evaluation. One is to provide thought leadership in areas where we operate. So it's really about understanding globally, what is the evidence base for the type of projects that we're delivering, and understanding, is that strong enough, and do we have this credible evidence that gives us the confidence that we're spending our money well? And so there's this thought leadership aspect, which is kind of externally focused, and that really goes into a lot of the selection of both the questions, the topics, the countries, the projects to be evaluated for impact evaluation. And the other thing is that we do see huge needs for operational learning. And so when we go into the impact evaluations, we again assess not only is this aligned with a big evidence priority for the organization, can this feed into a decision in the country or with the government partners that'll actually be useful on the ground? And so those two uses, those two purposes, the thought leadership and operational learning, determine a lot about when and why we do impact evaluation. And that's also why we chose not to have a universal coverage norm, because they do evolve. I do agree with you, though, that, I mean, the thing that excited me about joining WFP, and the reason I started this new approach here, I mean, we published our strategy and now we have a unit, is because humanitarian operations and the settings we work in, so fragile states, emergency settings, are probably some of the major, I guess, under-evidenced areas for our type of development cooperation. And so this transitional development piece or humanitarian piece are areas where most people had thought it would be nearly impossible to do rigorous impact evaluation work. And so that does point me to, one, a need for greater evidence, and then also a need for rethinking a lot about what do we think is possible in these contexts. And it gets to a lot of the issues that, I mean, Anastasia already talked about, like how do we collect quality data? How do we make sure that we can implement in a way where we can develop a credible counterfactual? What does that mean in fast-moving, heavily, I guess, complex environments where you have constantly to re-evolve and do things differently? So I think, yes, it's possible. Yes, it's difficult. And you probably can do different types of impact evaluation in areas that most people thought were not possible before. So I think it's actually quite exciting. Over.
Thank you, Jonas. Just a very quick follow-up. You pointed out earlier that you consider how the rigorous impact evaluation can feed into decision making. Can I ask your view on, from your experience, how effective this rigorous impact evaluations have been in generating useful and usable lessons that can feed into adaptive management? And I ask this because in the GCF's programming manual, evaluations serve the purpose of informing and adaptive management, which of course brings in the implementation aspect. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and it also happens in different parts of the whole process. So, for example, when we start engaging with a country office, some of the first discussions that we have are really around what's their theory of change, where are they going to work, how will they work, how many people can they realistically reach in the first 6 months, in the first year. And so immediately we see that there is a lot of changes that happen in the design phase. People rethink their targeting strategy. We've been even asked as part of our baseline exercise to roll a census in northern Mali, which was a support for the government, but also helped revisit a lot of the vulnerabilities, where people were and how that would actually support or be supported by the program. And so there is an active involvement of the impact evaluation in the learning process during implementation, from before, through baseline, through data collection. In the climate and resilience impact evaluations that we have ongoing, there's 4 of them. We also collect high frequency data. So it's a short survey that we collect every 2 months to understand what was the shock in the last 2 months, how are people used the support they received, what were the coping mechanisms. And there also, we've already seen after the first year, the chance for adjusting quite a few of our assumptions, but also actual implementation in countries. So there's this ongoing adaptive process. And then as you get towards the end, we actually are coming out with findings for our first 3 impact evaluations on cash and gender. And that's already feeding into the next cash transfer policy for WFP, which will be published next summer. And so I think there's there's examples of how impact evaluations support learning from start to finish. There's also examples from my time at DFID where you saw that it informed entire government programs, particularly in countries like Rwanda, and also that it changed a lot of the way governments in neighboring countries also viewed their programming. So it can have wider implications, particularly when it's rigorous and credible and it's published in a way that's, I guess, visible and demonstrated that something really does work. Over.
Thank you very much, Jonas. Fabrizio, would you like to weigh in on the question about the applicability of impact evaluation?
Well, certainly, if you look at IFAD's area of interest, which is rural development, it's particularly challenging. If you look at what impact evaluation, as you also reminded us, application in health sector, there you can run an experiment in a lab with you can also have a randomized controlled trial. The other thing is, importantly, in health, you have a treatment which is homogeneous. Think of a vaccination, for example. It's always the same dose of a vaccine, inoculated always in the same way, upper arm, always in the same dosage. When you look at the project, this metaphor, this doesn't work anymore. It doesn't hold. In a typical IFAD project, you have 5 or 6 components, maybe 10, 15 if you count together all the subcomponents. They're not administered in the same way. The dosage is not the same because people don't get the same type of investment, and they don't get the same mix. Some, for example, may have an extension intervention plus rural finance. Another one might benefit, if I benefit, from a road or from a agroforestry. So you're really looking at very different interventions. So the question is also, where is your level of analysis? Do you want to set it at the project overall, or do you want to assess the impact of packages, so parts of a project? So these are the things you have to look at. And of course, the methodology, there's a way to deal with them, but there's also some challenges to the validity, to the size of a sample that you need to do this. So it's quite a challenging environment, not to mention a lot of issues of spillover, which sometimes are difficult to conceptualize and capture. And of course, another problem that this is common to many others is that when we come to an evaluation, it's at the end. And so there's not really a baseline. And so you have to look at methodologies that don't require a baseline, propensity score matching being one of those. But in a way, it's not really the sort of ideal environment for an impact evaluation. It's challenging, but we worked on it. The other question is what project we give a priority, because we are unable with the budget that we have to cover all projects. In fact, we used to conduct one per year, and it was mostly our attention was to projects in countries where we were conducting another evaluation of more strategic nature, or we were looking at opportunities for doing something innovative from methodological point of view. At the moment, we have put it to a halt this impact evaluation because of COVID. So we thought that there were no conditions to do it safely for people on the ground, for project users, for people from government, for ourselves. So as soon as the situation improves, we might get back to impact evaluations. But we being selective to really serve as data collection for other larger evaluations and for methodological innovation opportunities, because the resources that we have are quite limited. Over.
Thank you, Fabrizio. Again, a very quick follow-up. What does IFAD consider as methodologically innovative?
Well, having new methods, for example, for data analysis, trying new methods that we have not tried before for data analysis, or they are not used profusely in the evaluation community. Also, new type of data, for example, using both geographic information system generated data, crossing them together with data at the household and community level. So this type of things in terms of type of data and in terms of type of analysis of the data. Statistical analysis, econometric analysis. Over.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much, Fabrizio. Anna, so GCF has a quite different model. So how is selection possible then when it is demand-based? You can discuss a bit more IEU's experience in LORTA program.
Thanks, Yunika. Although it's a demand-based approach, we have our selection criteria. So one of the selection criteria which was mentioned by Fabrizio is innovativeness, and here I would repeat him as well. It's methodological innovativeness. So, for example, application of GIS data, looking at reforestation, for example. This is something, I mean, not unique anymore, but something very interesting which we haven't yet applied. And looking, of course, at the results areas. So let's say if we have an impact evaluation portfolio, I don't know, training for farmers and livelihood support, material livelihood support. So maybe we want to include like water intervention, for example, look at the impact of water intervention on the population, targeted population. Then we, of course, we are constrained by the budget, so there should be a sufficient budget. We also look at the evidence gaps, because to my knowledge, the evidence is still scarce in this climate adaptation mitigation domain. So, but still we have to look at the gaps and fill in the gaps where they are. And of course, I think maybe one of the most important is that we can measure the results. So we first have to look, can we actually quantify the target of the project? So that's key. And maybe I can provide a few examples. So one of the impact evaluations that I mentioned that we recently completed in Malawi. So we looked at the participatory training approach for the farmers in the rural areas. It's called PIXA, which was designed by the University of Reading. It's been evaluated using qualitative data before, but this was the first impact evaluation, quantifiable, attributable change that we looked at. We found positive results. Will we do an impact evaluation again? Is it worth doing an impact evaluation of the PIXA approach again? Probably not. So that's something where I cannot say, maybe it's too ambitious, too proud to say, but we kind of fill in the gap here. Another point that I would like to bring up from my previous work at ICRC and humanitarian context, and Jonas knows better than I do, but we already know that unconditional cash is probably more effective in humanitarian context than conditional cash. So do we need a proper impact evaluation between these two approaches in humanitarian context? I don't know. Maybe there are questions about it, whether we need it or not. Do we need an impact evaluation of the food drops? Also questionable. Maybe we don't need a very expensive impact evaluation. Also, I would like to actually, it brings me to the point where we need to look, the budget of the project and the impact evaluation. So one of the impact evaluations in Kyrgyzstan that I worked before, the implementation was $100,000, but impact evaluation was 7 times more than that. So we of course also need to kind of balance that. Can we do such an expensive impact evaluation? Yeah, I think that's all from my end.
Yes, thank you, Anna. I mean, that is actually very interesting what you pointed out there on, the thought process that you follow when deciding, how do you select? And it's no doubt not an easy task to actually, decide. But I picked out one quite interesting point when you said, for instance, that we know that unconditional cash transfers are probably more effective than conditional cash transfers. And that is an example. Okay, I take that. But I guess there is always this question on impact evaluations on context or environmental specificity, i.e. external validity. Will the same results apply across different geographic locations or different contexts? And I just wanted to ask your thoughts on that, because that seems to be a very tricky one when you are considering whether the same question will yield similar answer in different contexts. Anna, any thoughts?
Thanks, Inika. It's a difficult question indeed, the external validity part. I can say from the 2 examples that I mentioned, in terms of PIXA, it's been evaluated qualitatively and also using quantitative data without just contrafactual in various countries. So I think here we can be sure of external validity. Yeah, but to some extent. In terms of the cash, unconditional and conditional cash, maybe I give this ball to Jonas, but I think there was a big study on that. So with not only academic literature, but also practical, other evaluation literature, not just impact evaluations and other experiences, practical experiences on the ground from ICRC standpoint. That's what I know.
Thank you. Jonas, I saw you with a little bit of smile on your face. Maybe you could weigh in on the question on external validity as well, based on your experience.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and it also raises additional questions that I think you probably are aware. But if for example, you know that that is an issue, and for cash, it's a really good example, because there you have this debate for a long time around what is the impact of cash transfers on gender outcomes, particularly women's empowerment, but also potential backlash or different issues related to intimate partner violence. And so when we started looking at cash and gender, there was kind of a split. You had a handful of studies saying that it was causing an increase in violence based on, again, changes in power dynamics within the household. You had a handful of studies that said actually it just reduces pressure on the households. If they're very poor, it actually just makes everybody better off. And there was this issue about, should you target cash transfers directly to women, and should you, particularly in WFP's case, target them for cash for work or cash for training type programs. And so we've been doing that in many countries before we did any impact evaluation, based on, again, best available evidence. But what we set out to do is to test that theory. Again, right now it's in 4 countries. So this is El Salvador, Rwanda, Kenya, and Haiti. And look directly on, if you were to make cash transfers to a household in exchange for women to participate in some form of public work or training program, what happens? And so we collected baseline data around gender-based violence. We collected a lot of baseline data around decision-making, empowerment. What do women do in their households? Outside the households, is this going to be a triple burden on them? And what we're finding is, from the first 3 that are just finishing, it's quite fascinating results. I mean, again, this is standardized data across multiple countries. What's really surprising is the similarities at baseline in terms of what actually is a challenge for women in these very poor communities, irrespective of which country they're in. It's also, what's fascinating is that some of the assumptions around will there be backlash tended to be, at least so far, fortunately, a little bit overly pessimistic. And so what we're seeing is that there is a change in perceptions of women's work. There's also a change in women's control over income. There is a slight decrease in terms of a negative perception amongst men in families where women start working, which, okay, but we don't see an uptick in gender-based violence. So at this point, it looks like it may be causing a few grumpy men. So we're following that closely, but it is interesting because that raises this issue around not just country specificity, but also timing and thinking a lot about what do we know from whatever the last 10 years, and is it really going to be relevant to the next phase of this country's development or this next challenge that we're facing? So when I think about that, I actually don't see this as something that could end. In the same way you don't expect people to start closing up their medical faculties at a university as soon as they have a vaccine, they need to have a new one for the next season. I don't see there's an end to this process. And I think that's why when you get to like talking about things like gap maps for evidence, I get a bit puzzled, but also I think they're useful for pointing out where evidence is. It doesn't tell you anything about whether or not you need more. In fact, having like one study on one topic in one country probably tells you don't know anything. You probably need to have a handful of studies in multiple countries before you start knowing a little bit. And then if you don't dig into that, even if you have 20 studies, you don't know if that's just a big debate. And you probably need to know that because maybe you need 100 more and it's not done. So I think there's a lot of questions about what do you get when you have one study. I'll just leave it there. Over.
Amazing, Jonas. Thank you very much. Yes, so colleagues, this is your chance to ask the panelists any questions you might have. So please don't hesitate to type your questions into the chat box. I will read them as we go along. At the moment, I am just enjoying myself asking my questions to the panelists, and I'll be very happy to share this joy with everyone in this webinar. Okay, so I'll move on a little bit, but still picking up on the point that actually almost all of you mentioned on the selective, the need to be selective and strategic, and this is the the limited resources. So it's not a secret that impact evaluations, of course, depending on the methodological design, it could be expensive. So I was just wondering, from your experience, in face of scarce resources, at what point could you say that the benefits of undertaking an impact evaluation outweigh the costs of undertaking them for a specific project. Shall I start with Fabrizio for this question?
Thanks. I would say that in the most case that I know, in reality, the cost of conducting an impact evaluation is a fraction of the cost of a project. So most of the cases I've seen in my own experience, we are talking about 1% or less of the cost of the project. So maybe we go up to 2-3%. So fundamentally, I think it's justified to spend 2, 3, 5% to evaluate the other 95%. So that's of course you can have other cases which are extreme, like the one that Anastasia was telling us about, but these are more the exception than the rule. I think it makes sense. The question is also, to me, looking into the future, who is going to conduct this impact evaluation and what is the role of the sponsor international organization? Because my dream, which is still, well, I hope it will not be a dream, it's like to be less and less a dream and more a reality, is that the entity that is in charge of implementing a project, in the case of IFAD, it's a state entity, state agency, they should be in charge of conducting or commissioning impact evaluation, and IFAD role should be more and more that of a technical advisor and quality assurance. Rather than doing it ourselves. I think that's, to me, that's what should happen in the future. That requires a commitment from the government, but also commitment from the agency, because then you have to help them when they prepare the theory of change for the exercise, when they prepare the approach paper, when they prepare the methodology. So there you have to be present. It may be the independent office or even the management that works with them, but someone with experience in impact evaluation should be there to support them. So I would say that should be more and more part of the budget of the project implementation, and then the organization comes in for technical support, and the independent evaluation comes in at the end to look at the results, critique the methodology and the findings, and also add other type of data and triangulate. In most cases, what I've seen is a fraction of the evaluation is a fraction of the project. If it's just a small pilot, then perhaps with small budget, then you don't need a full-fledged impact evaluation with 2,000 households. You may need something simpler and quicker for a first check on the results. Over.
Okay, thank you, Fabrizio. Anna, would you like to weigh in on the question? I mean, considering also that, you know, the GCF work with a wide range of accredited entities with, you know, different levels of capacity. So I think, you know, the resources required in some cases to build capacity will be, you know, not insignificant in this case.
Yes, thank you, Janica. Well, here I would maybe agree with Fabrizio that there should be 1-digit fraction for an impact evaluation. And for us as well, maybe I can just build up on what you said, just give you one example. For example, sorry, one example from Bangladesh we have. So for the baseline data collection, we had an inception phase for the baseline. We did the training for the UNDP team. But for the endline data collection, it's the UNDP team who is training the data collection team on the ground. And we have trust that that the team is I can't say we built their capacity. They're just I think they're just a very good team, you know. So they are doing it themselves now. So we actually gave a lot of work is done by the entity itself. So which is great. And there we also trying to be a bit creative in how we can reduce the costs. And this is quite critical for us because project teams, of course, they are not sometimes happy when we say that the data collection may take up to this amount. So we look at the indicators. We try to tailor, you know, what indicators we can measure, what can be the sample size, how we can limit maybe the sample size, and maybe be less ambitious. Right now, we don't look at sustainability. We only look at the short-term impacts for the moment. We need to utilize more GIS data, especially that which we do not have to pay for and which is free. So that all those things can limit limit the costs. One thing which I would like to also bring is the availability of data. There's more and more data available now, and how we can utilize all this available data to not to collect more data, you know, I mean, like how we can use it for an impact evaluation, so we can also reduce the cost there. I don't have an answer to that, but I hope that in the future we can utilize, we can do that more.
Okay, thank you. So let me bring in Hakim, our colleague from DPM. He has a question. Hakim?
Yes, thank you. Thanks for this very interesting presentation and discussion. I had 3 questions, but I will just ask one and put the 2 on the chat. And my question, I'm interested to know the experience of Fabrizio and Johan and Jonas with the government demand to steer and to use their national institutions to conduct impact evaluations, and how this sometimes conflicts or comes in opposition to organization wanting to do those evaluations in a very independent way. So I would be interested to hear from you whether you came across these kind of situations and how you manage them. And I had another question on using participatory methodologies for evaluation and assessment, and also about the timelines, which is a complement to the point that Unica raised about the cost, because we have these issues of because rigor means money and means long timelines, and sometimes sometimes we lack both the money and the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hakim. Very good questions. Maybe we can start with Jonas. There were 2 questions there, but up to you.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, so yeah, I mean, in our case at WFP, we do a lot of impact evaluations where the government is a major partner. We also have contexts where we work where the government is, for many reasons, not as strong or able to engage in, and these are very fragile countries we're working in. So we're working in, South Sudan's, Afghanistan's, Yemen's, Darfur. So there's lots of challenges where we work. I would say where the government is actively engaged, like for example, in Jordan, we have an impact evaluation on a school feeding program there. The government is the counterpart. They're very much engaged from the beginning. They are also excited. I mean, this is done with WFP and the World Bank. So we work a lot with the World Bank Development Impact Evaluation Division DIME. And they immediately were excited that this would be a way to demonstrate, learn about their school feeding program and then demonstrate to both WFP and the World Bank that it works. Because again, the World Bank for them is a major source of their funding for their entire government. So I think actually in that case, the government demand is one of the reasons we ended up doing the impact evaluation. I think there's a bit of an assumption that governments don't want this. And in fact, they do want rigorous evidence to go back to their major players in the country, but also their international organizations that they have to convince. And so I think that answers the first question. The other piece on how to involve people from the country or their institutions, we involve them from the beginning. I mean, the ministries are involved in the design workshops from day one. They're part of the governance of the independent evaluation, so they have a role, they're engaged. And I think that's super important. And we would like to in the future also expand our partnerships in terms of the teams that we construct for these impact evaluations to include more regionally based academics and regionally based people. Now, that is a challenge. It's a long-term dream, and I've experienced it in the past. It can work well and be difficult at times. So I just want to say that that's something that would be an ambition for us. Over.
Thank you. Fabrizio?
In our case, in reality, the impact evaluation that we have conducted were of a traditional sort. So we really were on the driving seat. We were conducting the data collection, the data analysis. The government was providing some type of support, such as logistical support, for example, that it was done really by us. The IFAD management has also started a program of impact assessments where they also conducted themselves. So it's not done by the government. But on the other hand, there are some projects in which the government or a government agency decided to do their own impact as evaluation or impact assessment, as it is called. And there, most of the cases were commissioning it to a university rather than doing it themselves or to a regional consulting, national regional consulting company. So I would be glad, as I said, in the future to see more of this third example where the government is on the driving seat and where IFAD acts more as a technical advisor to make sure that the methodology is sound and that the inference that you can make from the analysis is in a way acceptable, is a correct one, and you avoid to the extent possible any bias. The type of impact evaluation we conducted ourselves, that's the second question. We're trying to combine quantitative data with more participatory data, and we had rural sociologists or anthropologists in the team helping us do that. So combining it and trying to compare. Sometimes the findings converge, sometimes they didn't, which is also an interesting finding in a way. And I would say also, just to go to the third question, the timeline, it's very challenging when you come towards the end of a project and you don't know much about the project history to conduct an impact evaluation. There's a lot of mistakes you can make, even gross mistakes, like, for example, sampling the wrong community because you don't have someone who knows exactly how the assignment of certain project activities has worked. So it's the advantage of someone who has been working on the project is also knowing a little bit of history. If it's combined with a credible organization that doesn't create too many biases and has some level of objectivity, I think it's a right way to go. Over.
Thank you very much. So we're down to our last 2 minutes, and probably this is a very wrong move from my side to be asking about this at the very end. But I'd like to ask you if you could share a very brief reflection on how you go around the ethical questions that normally surround, randomization. This is a typical question, and I think it's a quite interesting one because WFP, a humanitarian organization, IFAD focuses on rural poor. The GCF, when you talk about climate vulnerabilities and who gets to benefit what and perhaps even when, then ethical questions come into play. So maybe we will close on this very important question. It's big, but I thought it would be a travesty if I don't raise ethics in an impact evaluation webinar. So maybe Anna, we'll start with you.
Thanks, Janika, for raising this important question. I'll be quick. So first, we apply for ethical clearance if we do a randomized control trial. And I would also mention that sometimes it's definitely difficult to get a buy-in from the implementing agency to do a randomized control trial. But the ethical question is a little bit tricky because randomization also provides a fair allocation of resources if the resources are scarce. So on the other hand. So that's, of course, a way of how you speak with the entity, trying to understand the implementation and trying to resolve the ethical dilemma. Thank you.
Thank you. Fabrizio, any quick reflections on ethics?
I think in general, there's also, I would say it's important to know that there's good guidance on ethics on evaluation in general from the UN. If UN evaluation group has provided good guidance 2020 on ethics, I suggest everyone who is not familiar to familiarize. It's a very good book. In terms of impact evaluation, I think one of the key issues in our case was also to protect the integrity of the data, so particularly by protecting the views and creating a safe space for people who were interviewed to express themselves. Even if a questionnaire may seem aseptic or objective, in reality there are some questions that may trigger some biased response or some pressure from the government of a project on the interview, and the same happens also with quantitative and qualitative interviews. So that's one of the cases to protect the integrity and of the data, and also the anonymity, if you want, and confidentiality also of interviews. Over.
Thank you. Finally, Jonas.
No, thanks. I mean, I think ethics is a hugely important topic for impact evaluation, but it's also important for all types of research and all types of evaluation. So, I mean, I think people, I mean, in WFP, there's a fear of randomization based on a lot of, I guess, sensitive experiences or people who made a big deal about it. The reality is, for WFP, we cannot withhold any aid. So we have to have programs that fully utilize all of their budget for the affected people at all times. So there's no way a randomization could get in the way of that. What we try to do is either randomize the phases or randomize who gets selected based on the full budget available. Or what we're doing more and more is what we call A/B testing. So comparing different modalities with other viable options to see which one's more cost effective. However, I would also just like to highlight that the process of evaluation itself needs to be ethical. And so, I mean, Anastasia was talking about IRB ethical clearances. That's not common for most types of evaluation, but we do that. We register all of our trials with external registry, either AEA or RIDE on 3IE's website. We make sure we have our IRB ethical clearances. We have our tools tested, our surveys tested. They also get reviewed by ethical boards that are not in WFP. And I think this actually is kind of an area where impact evaluation is quite far ahead of the rest of evaluation, although many evaluation people would not realize how much time goes into preparing and making sure there's an ethical process before we start any impact evaluation. Over.
Well, thank you very much. We're 3 minutes over now, so I think it's time to let everyone go. Thank you very much for this incredibly rich and interesting discussion again. Fabrizio, Anna, and Jonas, it's a pleasure to have you in the IEU webinar, and thanks everyone for your time, for joining us in this webinar. Prashant, would you like to have final words, or we'll call it a day? Okay, we'll call it a day. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a nice evening in Songdo, and have a nice day in Rome. Goodbye.